It began with a prayer and ended in the howling of the sea. In the summer of 1588, Spain's King Philip II launched what he believed would be a holy war. The ships were blessed, the sailors were confident, and the wind seemed favorable. Nearly 130 vessels, galleons, galleasses, and supply hulks, set sail to invade Protestant England and depose Queen Elizabeth I. The Spanish Armada was the most powerful fleet ever assembled in European waters, and yet, only half of it would ever return home. The other half? Smashed to splinters, dashed on jagged coasts, scattered by tempests, and swallowed whole by a sea that refused to kneel. But the story of the Armada's destruction is not just one of storms and failure. It is a story of men clinging to broken masts, of foreign corpses on Irish beaches, of the quiet, unseen violence that happens when a grand plan meets the raw force of nature. And for centuries, the sea has kept that story, revealing it only in pieces, in bones and cannon and rotting timbers unearthed by shifting tides. This is the true story of the Spanish Armada's final fate, and the men who drowned with their god. The seeds of disaster were sown in ambition. Philip II, ruler of the Spanish Empire, believed it was his divine duty to restore Catholicism to England. The Protestant Queen, Elizabeth I, had excommunicated Spain's influence and sanctioned piracy against its treasure fleets. But beyond politics and profit, there was pride, hurt pride, wounded pride, and Philip would not let it stand. He called his fleet the Invincible Armada. It was anything but. The plan was deceptively simple. Sail from Spain, link up with an army of 30,000 men waiting in the Spanish Netherlands, and land on English soil. Take London. Kill the Queen. End the Protestant experiment. But even before the ships had cleared Iberian waters, fate was turning. In the Bay of Biscay, violent storms damaged key ships, forcing the Armada to return for repairs. It delayed the invasion and weakened morale. Still, in July of 1588, they tried again, this time reaching the English Channel. But the English were waiting. The battles that followed weren't decisive in the traditional sense. English fire ships scattered the Spanish formation at Calais, while their faster, more maneuverable vessels picked off isolated ships. The Spanish, with heavier galleons, struggled to regroup. But the real enemy wasn't the English. It was the weather. After failing to establish a foothold, and with no safe harbor, the Armada was forced to retreat north, past the English coast, around the top of Scotland, and then down along the western shore of Ireland. It was here, in the unfamiliar waters of the British Isles, that the real tragedy unfolded. The ships had no detailed charts. Many were damaged. Food was spoiled, water was rank, disease was spreading. And then came the storms. September 1588. Imagine being on one of those ships. The cold bites harder than steel. The wind doesn't just howl, it screams, shaking the very timbers beneath your feet. The sails tear like paper. The masts creak, snap, collapse. The ocean lifts the hull, then slams it back down like a child punishing a toy. You see land, but there are no harbors, only cliffs. There's nowhere to anchor, nowhere to shelter. You pray. And then you die. One by one, ships smashed into the coasts of Ireland and Scotland. Some ran aground on shoals, others were blown inland and dashed against rock. The survivors of the wrecks, if they made it to shore, found no salvation there. In some Irish villages, locals helped the wrecked Spaniards, giving them food, clothing, shelter. In others, they were hunted like animals. The English authorities had warned against assisting the enemy. Some survivors were captured and executed. Others were stripped, robbed, and left to die in the bog. It's estimated that up to 6,000 men died on those final shores alone, and some were simply never found. One of the most haunting wrecks was that of the galleass Girona. After limping through the storms with hundreds of survivors from other ships on board, Girona attempted to make it to Scotland. But on October 26th, she struck rocks near Lacada Point on the Antrim coast in Northern Ireland. Of over 1,300 souls on board, less than 10 survived. Local fishermen found the dead strewn across the coast for days. In the 1960s, the wreck of Girona was rediscovered. Divers recovered gold, jewelry, weaponry, and an eerie number of religious icons, crosses, relics, and devotional medals. One ring bore the image of the Madonna, another, a Latin inscription, "I perish with God." It wasn't just a ship that sank, it was a floating chapel, and it went down with all its saints. Other wrecks dot the western coast of Ireland, at Sligo, Galway, Clare, and Kerry. Each one tells a different story, with different ghosts. At Streidoff Strand, 3 ships, La Lavia, La Juliana, and Santa Maria de Vison, were torn apart in the shallows. Bodies washed up in their hundreds, many stripped by scavengers. In 1985, the remains were discovered. Bronze cannons, stone shot, and shards of human bone intermingled in the sand. Some of it is still there, beneath the shifting tide. In Donegal, the Trinidad Valenciera went down in Kinnago Bay. Over 400 men survived the wreck, but they wandered into the hills and bogs, lost, hungry, and hunted. Most were eventually captured or killed. And in Mayo, there were tales of Spanish sailors who married local women, integrated into the villages, and never returned to Spain. Whether legend or truth, their blood may yet live in Irish veins. For centuries, the Armada was a cautionary tale, a warning about hubris, a reminder that God does not always bless the largest army. But the story never fully sank. Wreckage continued to surface. In the 20th century, the Girona's artifacts were put on display at the Ulster Museum. Cannons were lifted from the seabed, medals and crosses were recovered. And in 2015, violent storms uncovered timbers from one of the Streidoff Strand wrecks, wood over 4 centuries old, still preserved beneath the sands. These aren't just relics, they're voices. And perhaps the most chilling aspect of all is that some of the ships may still lie undiscovered, beneath kelp forests, under sandbanks, or deeper, in cold water trenches. Ships that once carried royal banners, armaments, and hundreds of terrified men, now reduced to bones and ballast. You can walk the shores today, especially in Western Ireland, and still find fragments, a bit of iron, a piece of wood, sometimes even a human tooth. The sea never forgets. In the end, the Armada lost over 60 ships. More than 15,000 men died, not in glorious combat, but in confusion, starvation, drowning, or exposure. King Philip II, upon hearing of the disaster, is said to have murmured, "I sent my ships to fight against men, not against the wind and the waves." But history doesn't care about intentions, it cares about outcomes. And the outcome of the Spanish Armada was not just a failed invasion, it was one of the greatest maritime disasters in European history. One still echoing in salt water and stone, in graves with no names, and in prayers that no longer reach the surface. Thank you for listening to the Sunken Ledger. Subscribe for more true stories from the depths.